Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt. Welcome to Tutorial Tuesday. This is week 10. We are going to talk about backings this week. I actually got so many questions about backings that I'm going to take the next 2 weeks, this week and next week, week 10 and 11, to talk to you about backings. So I've put together a little bit of a presentation that I'm going to take you through now to help you figure out some things about your backings. So let's get started. So for this week, we're going to cover the best types of fabric for your backing, how to determine your fabric that you need for your backing, how to measure it, how to provide extra for the long armor, and how to select the best fabric for your backing, how to determine how to best piece your backing. These are all very important in order for you to figure out exactly how much backing fabric you need to purchase. Next week, we'll talk about the best way to cut your backing, the best way to stitch your backing, and the best way to press your backing. All right, so let's get started. What's the best type of fabric to buy for your backing? First of all, let's talk about the do's. You want to make sure that you're buying quality quilt shop fabric, the same as you're going to use for your front. You might think this is really expensive and it's only going to be on the back of my quilt. However, you've spent all this time, invested all this money on your quilt front. You want to make sure that it stays together. That depends on the fabric that you purchase for the back, as well as the thread that you're using to put it together and the batting that you put inside. Topics all for another week. However, think about shopping your local quilt shop's clearance section. I know for a fact 2 or 3 of the quilt shops I work with a lot, they are constantly moving fabulous fabric into their clearance section. It may not make the best front fabric, but it makes a great backing fabric. So shop there as opposed to going with cheaper fabric. Consider wide back fabrics. If you have a lot of trouble putting together a backing for your quilt, consider a wide back. Especially if you're making a king or queen, it might actually be a better investment monetarily. It might be cheaper. So think about that. You still may need to cut it down based on the size of your quilt. So don't just think you can buy a wide back and hand it over to your long armor and them not charge you for trimming it down. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Pre-treat your backing the same as you treat your front. So if you're a pre-washer, you wash the fabric that you're putting on the front of your quilt. Make sure you're washing the fabric that you're putting on the back of your quilt. Let's talk about don'ts. I had a lot of long armors email me and ask me to make sure I covered a few tips for you. Do not use a sheet for the back of your quilt. It's not the same thread count. Again, plus it's boring, let's be honest. Anyhow, don't mix fabric quality. So similar to, we're talking about, what best to put on the back and the front and what fabric you're using. Make sure you're not using cheaper fabric on the back, right? So don't go shopping at Joann's when you've spent all this money on the front of your quilt. Buy the same quality fabric. Again, think about those clearance racks. Use some caution when putting batik backing on a quilter's cotton front. What I mean by that is if you've used all regular fabric, quilter's fabric on the front of your quilt, think twice about putting batik on the backing. Now I say this with caution and not as a line in the sand, don't. And the reason for that is I mix my fabric when I put in my front. I have no problem using a batik with a quilter's cotton on the front. I probably drive my long arm friends crazy when I ship the quilts to them versus long arm myself, but I like the effect. So I have no trouble whether or not I'm putting cotton or batik or something that has a high thread count on the back of my quilt. Most long armors do have a problem though. If you're using straight up cotton on the front and then you're using a batik cotton on the back. And the reason for that is the thread count, and it's going to cause them tension trouble when they go to long arm it. They're going to have some trouble getting exactly right the tension so that the thread sits well. So that's the reason that's the reason to caution you. All right, let's talk about how to determine how much fabric you need for your backing. Now, I, as well as many other quilt designers, we tell you on the pattern about what you need to put together your backing. But a lot of that's going to depend on several factors. So let's first take you through measuring your quilt. And we talked about this before when you're putting borders on. Just because my pattern says that your quilt should be 62 by 62 doesn't mean it is. So make sure you measure it. All right, so let's talk first about a square throw. The square throw it's the same direction in both, it's the same width and length in both directions, right? So this quilt happens to be 62.5 by 62.5. So you're gonna measure it in both directions. If you're quilting it yourself, you probably want to give yourself an extra 4 to 6 inches. However, if you're sending it to a long armor, you need to give them at least 8 inches in each direction. So let's round up to the nearest inch. 63 plus 8 equals 71 inches. If I'm sending this to a long armor, I need to provide backing that is 71 by 71. Now, let's talk about a twin. A twin runs this twin is running 92 by 68, 68 wide, 92 long, right? A twin is longer, taller than it is wide. So you're still going to measure it. This happens to be 68.5 by 92.5. If you're quilting it yourself, add 4 to 6 inches. However, if you're sending it to a long armor, again, you need 8 extra inches in each direction. So 69 plus 8 is 77. 93 plus 8 is 111. Therefore, if you're sending this to a long armor, your backing needs to be 77 by 111. A queen. A queen is typically wider than it is taller. So in this case, I'm 103.5 wide and 86.5 tall. All right, so again, round it up. You're quilting it yourself, 4 to 6 inches. However, if you're sending it to a long armor, you need to give them that 8. So in this case, 87 plus 8 is 95. 104 plus 8 is 112. Therefore, you need 95 by 112 for your backing. Now, the proper size is very important if you're sending it to a quilter, right? If it's sort of like, the Goldilocks, right? If it's too small, it's not going to work for them. They're not going to be able to put it on their long arm. And if it's too big, they're going to need to trim it down. Here's the reason why. That you need to, 1, put 8 inches extra, and 2, why you need to send them something that's not too small or too big. When you load your quilt onto a long arm, you need to put it on leaders on the top and the bottom. Your backing gets pinned. So as a long armor, I have to come across and I have to pin my backing, and then it actually folds over onto itself. So that I'm going to need an extra 2 inches on the top and an extra 2 inches on the bottom. I'm also going to need to tack that quilt and have room for the head of my long arm to move off that top at times. Therefore, I need that extra room when tacking, basting on the quilt, as well as whatever design I'm putting on that border. I may need to sweep off and have room for my head to come off. The same on the bottom. On the sides, again, I need the extra inches as well. 1, because my batting is going to bring in my backing a little bit as I quilt, depending on which batting type. We'll talk about that as well. Also, I need room for clamps. When I talked to long armors, they said that most often quilters are giving them often enough the wide, for the width. However, they're still shortchanging them on the top and bottom. So remember that. You also don't want to just take a guess and say, oh, I need 110 inches, so let me give them 120, right? If you've already counted in that 8 inches to get you to 110, adding that 120, giving them 10 extra inches, that's way too big for them. That, you know, a long armor doesn't want to roll a bunch of empty fabric, nor do they want a bunch of empty fabric hanging off the sides. So again, trim it down to perfection. Otherwise, your long armor could charge you additional money. If you're short, they may have to sew on additional things so that their leaders have something to go on to, or their clamps, or if it's too big, they're going to have to cut it down and they're going to charge you for their time. You'd want to be paid if you were doing the work. All right, let's talk about selecting fabric for the back of your quilt. I'm actually pretty well known for my backings of my quilt. I have a reason for that. When I am at a trunk show and the guild is bringing up my next quilt, I need to be able to tell what that quilt is from the backing. Because when I fold my quilts, as we talked about a few weeks ago, if it's quilted, the quilt top is folded inside. Therefore, when I look over to see what quilt is coming out of the bin, even though I may have organized them in a certain order, when you're in the heat of things, you sometimes need a cue. Therefore, I make sure that most of my backings are very notable to me. I know exactly what is on the front of that quilt by the backing. Now, you need to decide the right backing for your quilt. And there's a lot to think about. It's not just like, whatever. A lot of people ask me, do I select them with the quilt, by the way? And sometimes, but very rarely, I have to tell you. I usually wait for the quilt to be finished and then I will purchase fabric for it. An exception would have been my sparkle, which I picked this beautiful Allison glass that was a complimentary fabric. And here in my periwinkle, I selected the fabric at the same time because I love this fabric. I couldn't use it on the front, but I wanted to make sure I used it on the back. So those are cases in point when I purchased it ahead of time. Otherwise, it's typically after. These are the things you want to consider. What type of fabric did you use on the front? If you use flannel, you're going to want to use flannel on the back. If you use quilter's cotton, you ideally want to use quilter's cotton. We already talked about batik. If you're using batik, the majority of batik up front, I would pick a backing that's the majority batik. Or if you used all batiks, use a batik backing. Are there large areas of light and are there large areas of dark? Because depending on the batting that you use and the purpose of this quilt, you potentially could see through this quilt. So you want to make sure that you're picking something that doesn't show through. For instance, my periwinkle here, you can see I had a very large amount of white. So therefore I chose a backing that would not stand out too much if there was light presented behind it. This is my amusement quilt, another one that had a lot of white space and a lot of different colors in the front. So I wanted to use something neutral. You all know how I think green is neutral. So it should be no surprise to you that I picked a light green backing to go on the back of it. One, it wouldn't show through if it was hung at a show. And two, green goes with everything. So no matter what thread was put down, it was going to match the back. Okay. How about, what are you going to use this quilt for? Is it a utility quilt for everyday use? Are you going to put it as a wall hanging? Are you going to be entering this quilt into a show? And do you want to see the quilting? So let's start with the bottom. Do you want to see the quilting? This quilt is my Moonlight Garden, and my good friend Carol Perkins quilted it for me. It was supposed to be taking tours in several quilt shows right now. However, with the pandemic, they've all been canceled. So we wanted to see the stitching on this quilt. Therefore, I chose a very neutral back. It happens to be the same navy grunge that was used on the front. So in this case, we wanted to see the quilting. Therefore, I went with a solidish backing, which is very unusual for me. Now, many people may pick a solidish background and you don't want to see the quilting. So therefore, if you are new to quilting, you're quilting it yourself and you're afraid of what the quilting might look like, you definitely don't want to pick a solidish background. Now, this is my logo for Lemoyne, which my friend Barbara Bregman quilted for me. This won several awards. Now this, when I actually put it together, or I sent the backing, I should say, to Barber, we weren't necessarily thinking about putting it in shows. So I did go with a floral backing. However, you can see that it's light enough in color that it's not competing with the white space. And when hung, the fabric wouldn't show through to the white. So I was taking that into consideration. If you're putting it on a wall, as a wall hanging, you might be able to be a little bit more boring. If you're using it as a quilt for utility, I would say pick something fun. Why are backings supposed to be boring? So that's just my take. All right, what kind of batting are you going to use? So wool is my favorite. It happens to be pretty thin. It actually is warm in the winter, but cool in the summer. I like it because it doesn't weigh a lot. I also like it because it doesn't hold wrinkles a lot. And when I'm packing quilts for trunk shows or storing them, I don't want them to stay wrinkly. Now, cotton has its purposes too. A lot of people say you put cotton on the front, cotton on the back. Let's go ahead and use cotton. If you're going to be washing it a lot, I would definitely say a poly blend with cotton works. If you want something poofy, of course, a poly blend also works. Wool works and is poofy as well, and you can see the quilting on that as well. So different things to take into consideration. We'll get into batting it another week in way more depth. But in this case, the color of my batting was something of note for my Diamonds in the Sky. Again, Barbara Bregman quilted it for me, and you can see her fabulous quilting on the back here when she used her yellow thread inside the assorted colors, and then she used black thread inside the black. However, she wanted to use a black batting. So that batting being black made sure that I had to put a black backing on the back. So that's what that calls for. Now, here in my ComCs, this was actually double batted. So I used wool and cotton. And the reason for that was two purposes. I intended to custom quilt it a little bit more than I ended up doing due to a deadline, but also because I wanted to put on this fabulous backing. So I was concerned that this backing, which happens to be a wide back by Free Spirit, would actually show through the white. So therefore, I chose chose to double bat it. Just things you need to take into consideration. So now the big question, I think where most people have concerns, is how do I figure out how to piece my backing? How do I approach it, and how much should I use? So you need to think about a few things up front. What direction do you want to piece this, right? So is it a twin that's taller than wide? Is it a queen that's wider than tall? Is it a throw? How are you best going to, if you're sending this to a long armor, how are they going to want your backing, right? I'm going to tell you, they want it horizontal. They want that seam to go across their belly bar only once. So they want to hit it so that it's all across at the same time, that it rolls up, and when they're quilting, they know exactly where that seam is on the back. If you put your seams vertical and you want your quilt quilted a certain direction, and they roll that onto their rails, if that seam is all in one place, it's going to cause a bubble, if you would, a little extra bunch at the top and at the bottom, which could cause the backing to go a little wonky when they're in the process of rolling it back and forth. Again, this really depends on how much quilting they're doing. So just something to consider is when you're looking at your quilt, how do you think your long armor is going to quilt it? And make sure, if possible, to put those seams horizontal. All right. It's best to piece full length pieces. I know people try and use up their stash and they want to piece it. If you're going to do that, you need to take a lot of care with your seams. We're going to talk about that a little bit more next week. You're going to need to make sure that your straight of grain is in the same direction. Otherwise, your shrinkage and the stretching when it's on the long arm, it could distort the quilt. So make sure that you're piecing all your fabric in the same direction. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So here is a square quilt. right? I'm taking my first throw quilt that I gave you the example of before, my bloom quilt. We determined, needed a 71 by 71 backing. So we need to pay attention to which way we want the seam. So in a square quilt, it really doesn't matter, right? Because the long armor can switch the backing to their delight, you know, based on how they're putting your quilt on. The average width of fabric is 41 inches, actually, technically. Without the salvage, we're going to talk about that next week. So therefore, when I go ahead and put my seams, if I count that I have 40.5 usable inches, I usually factor that I'm only going to get 40 usable inches. Ideally, you're going to measure the fabric that you're going to use. I'm using the average because I'm trying to show you how to do the math. So if my fabric is 40 inches width of fabric, I'm going to cut one lengthwise piece that's 71 by 40. And then I need to figure out what do I need for the top. Could you piece this and use less fabric? Yes. I would tell you, think about the money you invested on the front. Think about the time you invested to put together the front. Think about what you may be paying a long armor to quilt this. And do you really want to cheap out on a yard of fabric? Is it really worth $10 to $12 to $15 for you to piece this backing? Plus, let's be honest, it takes more time. So in my house, this is what happens, is I've determined that I need another full width of fabric, and I'm going to trim it down to 31 inches. We're going to talk about how that is easy to do in next week's Tutorial Tuesday. So the math is 71 minus 40 equals 31. Therefore, I'm going to need 2 length pieces of 71. So I'm going to cut 71 twice, which means I'm going to need 142 inches. 142 inches divided by 36, which is a yard, tells me I need 3.95 yards. Now, since that is so close to 4 yards, I will tell you that I would probably, if I wasn't cutting it myself and ripping it to make sure I had straight grain, given that that is so close to 4, I'm buying 4¼ yards just to be on the safe side. That's going to give me an extra 4 inches for each hunk of fabric, 9 inches basically, longer than I need, but it's going to allow me to make sure I'm cutting it straight, which we're going to talk about next week. All right, a rectangular quilt, a twin, taller than wide. In this case, it's 111 tall and 77 wide. I want my seams, especially if I'm expecting my quilter to quilt it with the top and bottom in the normal position that it's viewed as. I'm going to cut it so that I'm cutting across 71, right? So I've already determined I'm going to need 77 lengths, inches, right? It has to be 77 wide, and I'm going to go with my width of fabric. So if I start subtracting from the 111, right? Because since I'm going the 77 wide, I'm going to need to build it so that it's 111 inches long. So I start off with 111 minus 40 equals 71, minus the 40 equals 31. Therefore, I've identified that I am going to need 3 widths of fabric, right? 3 lengths of fabric to get to my tall. So I'm going to need 40 plus 40 plus 31. Again, we're going to talk about how you trim this down to 31, but basically I'm taking the 77, timesing it by 3, since I need to go across 3 times, equals 231 inches, divided by 36, gets me to 6.42. Again, technically you need 6.5 inches, 6.5 yards. I'm rounding that up to 6 3/4 unless I'm cutting it myself. All right, now let's talk about a rectangular quilt that's wider than it is tall. This is where you get into a little bit of a dilemma. Now, your long armor wants to put, when they load this one, the quilt top, ideally, especially if they're quilting it directional, they're going to want to put it as it is going to be seen when it's say on your bed, right? So if you have directional quilting especially, they need to make sure your top is at the top and your bottom is at the bottom. But they also like to only roll it so often. So when a quilt is wider in one direction, ideally, if it doesn't matter how it needs to be quilted, they will always typically load the width longer, right? So ideally, so that they can roll it less, right? So for 95 inches, if I'm rolling that up as I go in quilting, I'm gonna roll it less often than I'm gonna roll if I had the 112, like the twin that we just talked about. So ideally, you have to take that into consideration as well. But let's go with the best for the long arm for a queen, which happens to be wider than it is tall. So in this case, I am going to cut lengthwise 112 chunks of fabric. And I'm going to need to get to 95 inches. So 95 minus 40 is 55, minus 40 is 15. That tells me I'm going to need 3 lengths of fabric to get me to my 95 height. So 112 times 3 equals 336 divided by 36 equals 9.33. So technically 9 1/3 yards, but of course we're not going to ask for that. We're going to ask for 9 1/2 because we want a couple extra inches to make sure that we have straight pieces. Okay, so we'll talk again about trimming that third piece down, because it might seem like to you, man, that's a waste. I have to buy 95 extra inches to just get 15 inches, right? So I hear you. So here's what you need to think about. One, are you willing to pick a non-directional quilting edge to edge, right? If that's what you're quilting it. You're quilting custom, it's not as important because they typically are quilting the block and each block. So if you were to turn this, right, and to piece it so that you're only putting together your 95 lengths, right? Because then you're timesing it by 3, you're 40, and 112 is a lot closer to 120. So you're going to use less fabric this way. The thing is your long armor okay loading the side on the top and this side on the bottom? So one is that the quilting has to be non-directional, and 2, your long armor is going to need to roll it more often, which really isn't a big deal. Most long armors will look at how your backing is pieced and then determine that's how they're going to load it. Your quilting on the top, your selection for the quilting on the top just has to go with that. All right. So in this case, if I'm going with lengths of 95, right, I need to get to 112. 112 minus the 40 is 72, minus the 40 is 32, which tells me I need 3 lengths at 95. So that's going to be less, right? 95 times 3 is 285 inches. 285 inches divided by 36 equals 7.91. So in this particular case, I'm buying 8 yards, right? Versus 9 1/2. So I'm saving myself 1.5 yards, basically $20. So again, it's up to you whether or not that makes sense for you and your long armor. So it's always good to call your long armor or email them and ask them. Show them what you are doing. Tell them, you know, here's a queen size quilt. Here's what I'd like to put on the front. Would you prefer I piece my batting so that it's, or my backing so it's horizontal, or can you take it vertically and turn it when you're quilting it? All right. So that's it for week 10. We've covered our best type of fabric for your backing. We've covered how to measure, what to put in extra for the long armor, how best to select that fabric for the backing, and how to determine the best way to piece it. Next week, we're going to talk about the best way to cut your backing, stitch your backing, and press your backing. So thank you for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope I see you back here next Tuesday.